So we have 5 distinguished panelists, all of whom you met at least briefly already this morning. So Virginia Rauh, Routt Reigart, Maida Galvez, Chen, and Emanuela Taioli. And they all gave just incredible presentations. What I was hoping is that while you're thinking about your questions and writing them on the yellow cards, that I would ask each panelist who's willing to do so to just do a brief kind of what is the most important take-home message that you would like people to take home, you know, from this conference about your work. So is anybody willing to sort of kick us off with that? Gia?
Well, I guess my message is, well, first of all, cancer is not, you know, the whole part of health. There's many other health effects of chemicals, not just glyphosate. We should care about, especially among developing children, and so they are not little adults. And so, and the other things also, I guess, you know, glyphosate is not Roundup, so we should have to have more holistic views of any chemical exposure, even though we consider glyphosate, but then there, I mean, we're co-exposed with so many other different chemicals, so, and I think that's another thing we should keep in mind.
So I think my take home is from so much work and review I did of all of the literature is that there is really a policy of not funding or not facilitating studies to look at what's happening in humans. And so it's difficult to move forward if we don't have the basic information on how many people are exposed, how the exposure changed over time, how many kids are exposed. I mean, we're missing a lot of information, so we really need to push that area of knowledge in order to move forward with the health effects.
Is this one on? When I talked a little bit about our publication, what I didn't mention is that when we got our first reviews, one of the reviewers said, "This is great." Second reviewer said, "This is something people don't believe in anymore. No one supports the concept that there are critical periods of brain development." And to which we responded, "This is absurd." And to me, just to echo what you just heard, it's not all cancer. And as a pediatrician, my greatest concern for children is events that occur in utero and early in life that lead to long-term later disease. And we've all heard the story of epigenetics and toxic stress in children leading to long-term disease. And so one of the reasons we emphasize these diseases that have their origin early in life is they are lifelong problems that we need to address, and we need to address by preventing the environmental injuries that lead to long-term neurodevelopmental problems. And I may be stepping on Dr. Rauh's major point as well, but I think we really need to focus on early childhood development, including in utero, and that's why we focused our paper, and there's a whole section in there on critical stages of neurologic development that I didn't even touch on today. But to me, that's really the issue, is what's happening very early in life that leads to lifelong problems.
So hi, Maida Galvez from Mount Sinai. I thought it was fantastic to hear from the researchers directly who are doing such cutting-edge science that's so critically needed across New York City and beyond. And it's so important for us to all work together to make sure that science is presented to the decision makers, because policy change is the most important intervention in terms of preventing and reducing exposure. So that's my take-home message.
My name is Virginia Rauh. I'm from Columbia University, and I would echo, I think, what the other speakers have said. There's a lot of need for continued work. I think that the point that early insult to the brain in particular can set the stage for longer-term health problems. Potentially, that's sort of where the neurodevelopmental trajectory meets the neurodegenerative trajectory. I think that folks who study some of these escalating neurodegenerative diseases have never thought about this. They don't go back early enough. They don't think about it, except for the genetic component, which in the case of Parkinson's disease is fairly small. So I would just, urge people to keep in mind, I'd go along with the funding issue that was mentioned, just keep following these people and get the science out there. I will say that the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences, which is part of the NIH, has been reasonably generous. And I have 2 new studies that were just funded within the last 3 months, and that's unusual. So I think somebody's paying attention.
Okay, I think we have some question cards here, which is great. Thank you for your wonderful questions. Okay, are there studies that specifically look at the effect of pesticide use on human health in Hawaii, particularly Kauai? Anybody want to take a, sorry, let me say that again. Are there studies specifically about the effects of pesticide use on human health in Hawaii and Kauai in particular? Does anybody want to take a stab?
Yes. I think that people have been working for a long time out there, and most of the studies are from on the test field. So don't forget that part, Kauai was the test field for Agent Orange as well. A lot of people don't know that, but the trade winds apparently come in one direction, and they pushed all the drift from the test fields onto the other parts of the island. And a lot of the proximity of where people live is really close. But I think that, I won't say that Hawaii is a done deal, but I think there's a lot of information there now, and just looking at the basic science, all of the major agrochemical companies are there in terms of using those test fields. So, okay, so we got rid of chlorpyrifos, but maybe there's more studies can demonstrate that some of the other chemicals that are still being tested are dangerous.
You know, I really love some of the historical stuff, and if you go way back in Hawaii, there was almost a crisis with heptachlor in milk. I don't know if there's anybody old enough to remember this, but they were using heptachlor on pineapple in those days, and the pineapple, whatever you call what's left over, the part that people don't eat, was being used as feed for dairy cows, and the heptachlor levels in the milk were really, really high, and it was definitely a very Hawaii-specific thing. I think that's, okay, next question. Whew, these are some of the hardest questions I've ever seen. How do you get the public to become engaged to stop pesticide use? Anybody willing to take a stab at that? I mean, I say one thing that, you know, all of the researchers on our panel, by doing the research that they're doing, that is one of the things that gets people engaged, because without that, again, I'm old, so I always think about history, but you know, before the Columbia study on chlorpyrifos, we could talk about chlorpyrifos and what it did to the brain, but it was much harder to get people engaged until you knew that real kids were being really impacted by this chemical. Like, that really speaks to people. Anybody else want to jump in here?
Just to comment, I've been active my whole career with the Academy of Pediatrics, and the things that pediatricians have experienced is that the public is very much engaged, and more and more pediatricians are asked by families, should I feed my child organic? Is there an advantage to organic? What are the so it's actually a little bit of frustration for me that it's harder to get the docs involved than the public. And at this point, the public is more involved. And what that resulted in, I think it's been 5 years now, the Academy published a technical report on pesticides in food, which Dr. Roberts also was involved with, and at the same time published an analysis of the benefits of organic foods to children. So there is some involvement, and it is pushing our professional organizations to take actions to advance organic and decrease pesticide exposure. And I'm sure Maida has something to say to that.
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think that, you know, for many of us in the environmental field, we all feel like small nonprofits, right? We all face the same challenges: limited funding, limited capacity, but you know, together we're stronger, essentially, right? We sort of find the champions, whether they're in the schools or the communities or at the state or federal level, and work together to advance the overall goals of healthy environments for all families. And so it really sort of takes getting out in the community and working with partners like We Act for Environmental Justice and others who I know the Columbia Center functions under that model of, you know, working with community partners, as does Mount Sinai and many other research centers across the country. So it really takes finding those champions and supporting them in their efforts to promote healthy environments.
Here's another question.
My name is Mike Papa from Connecticut. I'm work with ecosystem without the use of chemicals. So basically, I think what would motivate the people to actually, you know, all mom and pops that would like to have, you know, not having the risk of having a pesticide in the cell wall membrane of their kids or their pets and all that. The question is, we have to learn how to be better steward of the land. So we have to learn how to manage the water, the carbon, the oxygen in a changing climate. If we don't fail to do that, then we're never going to be able to succeed. Actually, I have my colleagues that they fail miserably on the organic because they just don't do it right. They overdoing, they're polluting, they are not doing it, they're lying. You know, so the consumer sometimes becomes very skeptical about it. unless we perform. Okay, so we perform, okay, my business went up 100% 2016, only because people, skeptical people, they were able to actually go take a look and say, actually, this guy did it without using pesticides, and because we allow the energy and nature to produce the fertility and keeps on going. That's if we lose on that, we're gonna, we're gonna really. Right now, the cancer is about, if I'm not wrong, it's about 1 out of 3. Before it was 1 out of 50, not too long ago. I guess we have to somehow license these land care people. In Connecticut, they don't even license the landscapers. You become a landscaper, $250, you're a landscaper. So people go in the Home Depot, buy pesticides, fertilizer, keep on doing things. I don't know about New York. Yeah, we have to somehow put people on the road that they are stewards of the land. And the nature will do things on its own.
So here's another question, and asking our researchers. I keep forgetting, sorry. This question is asking our researchers, are any of you able and willing to testify either in person or written testimony to help communities that are trying to pass pesticide-related ordinances, bans, or whatever it is? I know that's a really tricky question for academic researchers, but anybody want to take a stab at it?
So I personally think that we have a role as a scientist that is so valuable that we have to really work on that. It could be very helpful for somebody who can then translate it into more applied actions. Sometimes getting into testifying for one side or the other kinds of burns away that strong feeling of trust in the academic and science part. So we're always very hesitant to trespass that barrier because we look like we are more helpful. In reality, we become less helpful for a cause or for an improvement.
So I would agree to some extent about advocacy, which is really not what most academics do. However, what I think has been happening lately is there have been requests for science. And if you're invited, no matter if it's a legislative briefing or what it is, and you get to just give a little science talk, I think that it's particularly effective. And my recent experience in Hawaii was really terrific because after we did that, it was a regular talk, kind of like we would give here, and it was piped into all the legislators' offices, so they didn't even have to come to the auditorium. Then they heard that, and then there was a bill that had been introduced. But then the Governor Icahn in Hawaii, who's an engineer by training, a really bright guy, had asked to meet me, and I went up to his office, and he had on his desk a very recent paper that I'd written, which was in the New England Journal. He clearly read it, and he asked me other questions about the science. So I found that really quite a good experience. I didn't feel compromised in any way. I didn't feel really like an advocate, but he said, "Why is this bad for people?" And I, told him. So I would agree, this is a delicate area, but I think we can make a little difference if we're willing to, tell people, if we're invited. I don't know too much about other forums where it may be a little bit more a debate, and that gets messy, or, I don't know that I would enjoy that very much, but.
The next question is, are there, oh, I'm always forgetting.
Hi, my name is Frank Avila. I'm an elected official. I'm a commissioner at the Metropolitan Water Reclamation District of Greater Chicago. We cover the whole county, And our mission is to protect our water supply, Lake Michigan, for drinking people, for 5 million people, and to prevent flooding, and to treat the 2 P's in the pot. That's poop and pee. And we own a lot of land in Cook County. And I wanted to pass an ordinance not to use any synthetic herbicides. And I had a little problem because we're 9 elected officials, and I'm one of the 9, and the other 8 didn't know what to do, but a couple of them were environmentalists. And they did not want to pass that ordinance against synthetic herbicides because they were concerned about the weeds, about going into the native plants. So so they gave me about a month to prepare for a study session that lasted all day, and they had a lot of people come in. And so it took my staff a whole month, and my staff is not scientific people or research people, and that's the problem that we were facing, is that my staff did not understand your reports. Your reports are not at a 6th grade level. See? A 6th grade level or a 4th grade level. Okay? See, we need your reports to come down a little bit because it's so higher class for us. Okay? And so it took us a long time, and we did the study session, and we have a large research staff with a lot of scientists also. And my scientist was against the ordinance on glyphosate because they say glyphosate was not dangerous. Okay? And my staff went up there against me also. See? And these are scientists saying that glyphosate was okay. Okay? And so my staff came in and we did a lot of research. And we did a lot of research showing the harm on Roundup. We weren't talking only on glyphosate, we were talking on Roundup. My staff were talking about glyphosate. Yeah. And so at the end of the session, I had one commissioner that was an environmentalist, well known, and she was against stopping glyphosate. They wanted to use glyphosate for weeds. But we finally pushed it through. But it took me, as I mentioned, a couple of months to do the study, have this study session, because we didn't understand your reports on the 6th grade level. So I think to be helpful, when you do reports, you do one at the high class there, so all those high class people, scientists could understand, and then write another report for the 4th grade level. I think that's a problem.
Yeah. And I think more and more there are media outlets that are doing a really good job translating the latest scientific research into things that are appropriate for general audience. Carrie Gillum is the obvious example, but there's a whole lot of others that are really, I think more and more people are understanding the need for it, and so it's becoming much more common.
Yeah, that's such fantastic advice. Thank you for sharing that. I think that when we meet with decision makers, we say that, I'm a pediatrician, I say families are calling us and saying, why didn't I know about this? And that message alone is very powerful to them. And I think that one thing to remember is that everybody has a voice, and one of the most memorable legislative hearings that I went to was out in Suffolk County on BPA and baby bottles. And what impressed me about that day is that there were parents there were advocates, there were scientists, Consumer Reports was there, and high school students. And the high school students had been tracking the legislation. They were mentored by Huntington Breast Cancer Action Coalition. They had heard the legislators' concerns in past hearings and addressed them in their testimony. And all of those people speaking with one voice were able to convince the one legislator who hadn't made up his mind yet. And that led to the first passage in the country of a BPA in baby bottles ban, and then a voluntary withdrawal from the market. So the other point I wanted to make is that if an academician has a conflict for any reason in terms of presenting at a particular legislative hearing, the professional organizations actually sometimes do not have that same conflict. So wearing a different hat they could potentially participate. But it is important to remember that everybody's voice is important, so all of us can potentially testify.
Let's see. I have a new question here, which is talking about the pushback or the skepticism that many of you have experienced about your research and about research in general about how pesticides affect human health. So why do we get all that pushback or skepticism? Where is it coming from?
Industry professionals. And one of y'all has been on the Science Advisory Board, I think all of us at some point. And one of the things you're confronted with is folks from the people who are producing the pesticides who are scientists, but they're hired, their only job is to resist any negative research. And so when you get to an SAP or SAB or any of the, particularly EPA is really bad this way, it'll be one academician against 5 professionals, and they've honed their arguments. They spend a lot of time. That's all they're paid to do. And those of us that are really paid to be teachers and researchers at medical schools, we're not paid to do that. And I'll share that going way back to the 90s, when I was spending a lot of time at EPA, I actually made a big stink about why aren't you doing more to support academicians to work on your panels? You don't get paid. You get a stack of paper this tall to review before the meeting, and you're doing that while you're doing your research and your teaching and your patient care. So it's as it functions in many of these regulatory agencies, particularly EPA, it's not a fair fight. And it's designed not to be a fair fight. And I've never figured out the answer to it. And I think you may have experienced this. They have been pushing to have a regulation that people who did the research aren't allowed to serve on these panels because they're considered biased. Do you want to speak to that, Virginia?
So thank you for the question and bringing it up. I think that probably people who are not in academics or who haven't done the science may not know the extent to which industry actually comes after people. There's the famous case of Herb Needleman, who started out at Harvard, ended up at Pittsburgh, and he was the lead guy who looked at lead levels in children's teeth and first published a lot of that work, which of course was the beginning of what we now know is a horribly toxic exposure. And they just destroyed him. The lead industry just destroyed his academic career, and I would say he was certainly vindicated, but it was a brutal, brutal time. And I know that just if you go on Dow, DuPont, I mean, you can find that, I do junk science and all kinds of really discrediting information, and it can be very difficult when you're in a forum or at a conference, if these people stand up and say things. It's very incendiary, and you have to have pretty thick skin. Some of the animal researchers, certainly Ted Slotkin, who worked with chlorpyrifos for a long time at Duke, was willing to engage, and he would basically shout back at meetings. That would be a little more awkward for me to do. But one of the things I was just telling some folks that I was speaking to, when you're invited or asked to give some sort of testimony, I don't mean it has to be some official hearing, but when you're asked to tell people a little bit about this, one thing that happened a couple of weeks ago upstate in New York, when Todd Kaminsky has a bill to ban chlorpyrifos, and he said, well, another person will be coming to the hearing. Well, I know who that person was going to be. It was a person who's worked for Dow for 20 years. And the way we handled that was I said, okay, but I go second. So when this person got to do her spiel, Senator Kaminsky said, and remind us who you work for again, which I thought was very cool. And so she had to say it out loud. And then, you know, she just talked around, and it was, you know, not particularly scientific. But then I was able to say what was accurate and take it from there without attacking her, but having the last word helped a lot. So, I mean, I don't know if the question is intended to mean why industry would try to discredit the science. There's a very simple question to that. A lot of these products are very profitable. And if you get regulation in the US, they'll just export it. It's just like tobacco. I mean, you will see it over and over again, and you can call it greed. I don't know if it is greed, but it is just corporate profit, and that's what they're supposed to be doing. So I find, you know, they can stick up for their work, but the problem is, you know, that the nastiness with which they have come after academics is really very unnerving for those of us who aren't, you know, by nature wanting to have a fight. Herbert Needleman, really a wonderful, wonderful scientist, and it's quite a story.
I just have a commentary, and my first is that could you use the mic? Sure. I completely commend you for that work, to be able to do that and withstand that. That speaks volume. Thank you so much. Secondly, I really feel like there's a part of people who do good work that you all do. You know, stop taking a back seat and feeling as if that you have to be apologetic for that work. I think it's really important that the people, you know, you reach out to those people who are speakers out there. Maybe they're TED Talk people, maybe they're social media people that have a voice in this. We all have a voice, and I think that we're backstaging our voice that we need to do as people. I mean, why should we back down to these? If more people knew about these corporations and their greed that are basically, that are the reason why we're in this room today, if more people knew about that, I think that we'd have less concern, and you give the power to the people, and I think that things will change. We don't need to go to our legislators. We hire our legislators. I mean, come on.
And Hagi about saying something, but there's something that really, really troubled me, and that had to do with flame retardants. And I'm sure people don't know the full story there. When I was a younger person, there was this big issue about people smoking in bed causing house fires. Does anybody remember this? It was like a big deal. And so all of a sudden, these flame retardants were introduced, right? And you know, now we're 30, 40 years later. And the end of the story is very interesting. A, they really don't work. And any fireman could have told you that a long, long time ago. B, they're really bad for you. But what people didn't know is it was the tobacco industry that developed the flame retardants. And that was to keep their product still basically well received. I find that shocking. But it's not in the world of business. But it is a really quite a tricky thing to have done. So just in case people didn't know the full extent of what the corporate sector can actually do. And we're very tricked.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Tyler Smith at Earth Justice. I wanted to start by commending Virginia on her excellent testimony before the New York Senate Committee on Environmental Conservation. And I think you forgot to mention that at the end, the committee overwhelmingly moved the legislation forward to the Senate floor. I just want to note that there's, on this question of scientists engaging in advocacy, there are currently 5 different bills in states around the country that would prohibit the use of chlorpyrifos. And in every single case, passing the bill really requires scientists like Virginia to come forward and talk about their research. And so actually a former trainee of yours, now on faculty here at Mount Sinai, Megan Horton, testified in Maryland. Leslie Amkiros, a former trainee of investigators at Berkeley, also testified. We're seeing actually in Oregon last week, Bruce Lamphere at Simon Fraser University, along with Megan, as well as myself, testified. And we need to have these voices come forward to explain what the health risks are and explain what the scientific evidence is, because in every single state, including California next week, there is a concerted effort by Dow, by the American Chemistry Council, by the Farm Bureau, by others, to misconstrue the evidence. And kind of cutting through that and talking about the bottom line and what these studies have shown is essential to making any kind of progress. So I want to make my pitch for the academics in the room, academics who know, to be engaged, to come forward, to talk. I think it's actually essential.
I just can't resist telling a story from a prior forum, and this must have been the late 90s. It was a forum that was in Seattle. Were you there, Rauh? No. There's a professor at Texas Tech University, I think, who had just published what was basically the first published study showing that Roundup disrupted hormone production. And the senior author, Dr. Scirocco, spoke at the forum, and I got to eat breakfast with him. And I asked him, what had been the reaction to the study, and the research had actually been done by one of his graduate students, and he himself had never ventured into pesticide research before. He was a steroid biochemist, and he was used to doing research that had great scientific impact, but didn't cause any kind of public outcry. And so when the study was published, he started getting these phone calls from Monsanto, and the thing that struck me when he told the story was, they weren't saying we disagree with your research. What they were saying is, you are a lousy steroid biochemist. And he had a publication record as mile long, and awards more than I could even mention, and yet they were telling him he didn't know how to do steroid biochemistry. And I think at first he was really taken aback by this. And but then when I spoke to him later, he said, I just want to get it in writing. I'm going to sue for defamation, and it's going to finance my retirement. And I thought, what a great attitude. and just that overwhelming feeling of gratitude that a researcher like that was willing to put up with something which they should never have to put up with, that benefits us all.
So thank you for that comment about getting louder and more clear. I think you're absolutely right. That's totally where we need to go. All of my titles have environmental health in it, and nobody understands what that means. And that's the elephant in the room, is people don't get it, right? And it's like a horrible type, the Pediatric Environmental Health Specialty Unit. What is that, right? And so we need to, exactly what you were saying, in plain language, explain how this is impacting families in all settings, and some families worse than others. And telling your stories is equally powerful to telling the research. We need both. And so when we meet with decision makers, it's the clinical cases. that actually move them to action. They need the science behind it too, and that's why the science is so critical. So your stories are very powerful, and it's incumbent on all of us to figure out where those partners are in social media and marketing and communications, because we haven't quite yet gotten to the level where we're making enough noise. And so an advocate pediatrician said to me once when I was struggling with an advocacy issue, let's make some noise, and that's what we need to do. We need to get louder.
So I just wanted to add a little bit of my experience. So I've worked on pesticide issues for over, I guess we're getting on 30 years, but in New England mostly, in different state legislatures. And the one best, for me, battle-tested advocate that I have found in the room has not necessarily been the researchers, but has been the teenager who has the ability to command a room and speak truth. We did this with GMO, and this kid just totally engaged with the guy that headed the committee, and like, I'm Josh, I was born in 1995, I am the GMO generation. Room stopped. So I have found that in my experiences, unfortunately, believe it or not, the mothers talking about their children has not moved the legislators I've been around. I mean, it has, but not as much as that teenager talking truth. The legislators, for some reason, they love watching that next generation, be it a state legislature or a, but I have found with the science, almost more like one-on-one tutorials outside of the hearing room is a possibility. We brought, my state rep is a public health nurse, really great in Massachusetts, just championed the opioid bill, and so she gets it, so she'll be in a room one-on-one. We brought Dr. Lou, and she got it, and then she got me meeting with the speaker, which didn't do anything, but that's Massachusetts. So what I guess I just want to offer is those two little bits of information. We like to give the scientific information, and I like to do a lot of analogies and metaphors so that we can bring it to our level of understanding. But then you make your fact sheets based on that, and that's how you engage the people. And then have you guys speak at a public forum and really go into, but not too much detail that we don't understand. Give us, apples and oranges and explanations so that we can get it. And then maybe a couple of case study stories really help. Unfortunately, the one-on-one with science and legislation has worked, but in the hearing room, unfortunately, they get the same 3 or 4 minutes sometimes, and then they'll go on with the industry people getting 20 minutes. So that's just some of my experiences.
Okay, we've got a really interesting question here that I want to toss out to our panelists. How much research do we really need? Should not ask that question to researchers. But at what point do we say we know enough? The laws must change. Is the pesticide industry just sending us down an information rabbit hole, always wanting more and more proof? So I would love to hear you all speak to that. Anybody? Okay.
The paradigm needs to shift. As long as we've been dealing with chemicals and pesticides, we've been in a place where we / scientists have to prove that the chemical is unsafe and have not required enough evidence from the people producing the chemicals that they're safe. And as long as we're dealing with this structure of risk assessment, which we know doesn't work, we found it at chemical after chemical, we need, ideally, to not have any of the pesticides, but we certainly need to require the producers of the chemicals to show us convincingly that they're safe. And we have so many examples that they're not safe. And we've gone, like I said a little while ago, we've gone through this whole series of substitution, and every new agent that comes along proves not to be safe. But the paradigm's got to be turned on its head, and I don't know if anyone else wants to comment on that, but no one wants to comment. Does anybody agree with that? All right. Let me tell you, I have one more thing to say that Virginia reminded me of, which is when I have gone to legislative offices, both at state and national level, the first question you always get asked by the staffer is, how many people die from blank? Well, one of the things that Herb Needleman taught me many, many years ago was that his studies showed that in the middle, there was a loss of somewhere between 4 and 6 IQ points between the exposed and unexposed. And if you think about that, I don't know whether you have 4 or 6 IQs more or less than me, and we'll never figure. I doubt it. I doubt it. Because I'm old and declining. But then he produced this graph that plotted the IQs of all his subjects, and I'm sure you've seen it, Virginia. And what it showed was that, yeah, in the middle there was a small IQ decrement in the lead-exposed children, but at the top there was no one with an IQ above, I think, 130, and at the bottom there was a quadrupling of the kids that were impaired. So very small change on the average really hampers us as a society, and it was a very strong point that Dr. Needleman made, which is very compelling. And this is not true just for lead, which is his area, but for a lot of the, well, your OP studies, so that we really need to think in terms of not how many people are dying, but how many people are not reaching their full potential because of these pesticide exposures.
I think we have, okay. One very quick comment. Bruce Lamphere actually must have had their video department develop a very short video that I've actually used in presentations. It's titled Little Things Matter. And it shows that exact point that you made, Routt. So, and I would do whatever you can to make that go viral.
What I find is that people want to learn about the alternative. That even if they're willing to accept the pesticides, which I think the science and the stories are really evident, they want to know what to do. And because to do nothing, just to eliminate them, doesn't solve their need to do something. I think you spoke to it very well about saying it is possible to have. Right. And they don't, if it works, right? But the lists of people who can provide safe properties are unreliable at the moment. There is no registration. There is, I mean, I was interested to hear your comments because they're the exact experience that I'm having. Well, people need to be educated, though, of what they can do, how easy it is to stop, but mostly a direction of what they can do. So we've been able to do it with organic food, I think, fairly successfully. There are many people who come home with whole food bags and are buying organic food, and they are walking right across their lawns that are filled with pesticides, and the trees are being sprayed in the neighborhoods. How do they care for these trees without the spraying?
I have received a question here that I'm hoping Routt can answer. Is there any studies showing a correlation between glyphosate exposure and autism?
I won't say there aren't any because we didn't search on that, but I suspect there are. Do you know? I don't know. I mean, our search was limited to the two diseases I talked about. But having said that, you can find papers that relate, associate everything with everything, and you need to look at it systematically to begin to accept it as proof. So, yes, I'm sure there's such studies, but I don't recall any.
Yeah. I did want to mention that UC Davis research group, it's called the CHARGE study, and I'm not going to be able to remember what that acronym stands for, but they've been really focused on environmental exposures linked to autism, and their work is really excellent. So whoever asked that question could check that out for sure. Here's another question. I'm a woman who has had approximately 35 pesticide-induced illness episodes. 5 or 6 were major. Among other symptoms, had thyroid problems and 20 or 30 pound weight gain. Please point me to studies and explanations about obesogens, particularly with women. So I did want to mention 2 fairly recent books. There's Leo Tresson's book, I have to say this right, Fatter, Sicker, Poorer, I think, which is an excellent discussion of this type of issue. And also Bruce Bloomberg has a recent book. Does anybody remember the title off the top?
Obesogens?
Obesogens, yeah. And they're both like, relatively easy to read in terms of not being super, super technical, and really expert discussion of these topics. So I would definitely recommend those. Anybody else have any other recommendations that they want to make?
There's a great website, the Endocrine Disruption Exchange, and they post really good research updates regularly. That's Theo Colburn's work.
Let's see. Has there been research about detoxifying after exposure to glyphosate or Roundup to restore harm caused by exposure, especially the microbiome in the gut? Does anybody feel like they can speak to that?
I guess we're not there yet. I think the field is still trying to establish whether there is a health effects of glyphosate and Roundup. And I don't think we're in the stage of detoxifying. Maybe there are some incidents of accidental poisoning or overdose, but not I know that there is any detoxification procedures that is in place. Right, that's originally, so I think it has been used as antibiotics before. Exactly, that is, exactly. So, but it was developed as a herbicide, and I think they ignore the potential effects on the microbes. But you know, the microbiome field is like fairly new, so now we all know like microbiome basically is related to everything, digestive system, your brain. So there's like a gut-brain, you know, dialogue going on. So, and then now I think people start to reevaluate the effects of glyphosate.
The quick fixes would harm more in a way that people become ignorant about being steward. Because when you do certain solution one way, you give up the opportunity someplace else. So you don't exercise yourself to manage the water, to manage the oxygen in the soil, to manage the nutrients, a good balanced meal for the living organisms. All that you don't do it because you look like you solve the problem. Which, but the reason why there's a problem there is still there. Eventually comes back again.
So I can't speak to detoxification per se, but in reference to strengthening the microbiome and the gut, there is an excellent book called The Dirt Cure by Dr. Maida. And I urge anyone who's interested in trying to use that, that directive, that path, to look at that book. It is comprehensive. It's not just for children. Dr. Maida is a pediatric neurologist, but it is also very useful for adults, and I highly recommend it.
Hi, I'm Diane, and I've been learning about this and talking about it for over 40 years, and I've been in different areas of food nutrition throughout that time. And I would love if you could share with us your elevator pitch, because we've been talking about this for a long time. I need words that really hit to the heart of people when we're trying to educate them in just a few moments. So I'm sure you've had this experience yourselves at Thanksgiving dinner with, you know, a cousin. What do you say? What gets to them? What gets through?
I work for a company that has regenerative organic farming. We have 460 regenerative organic farming acres. So we've been doing this for quite a long time too. We've been doing this for decades. And they teach farmers throughout the entire country about organic farming. And one of the things that was told to me was that we have 10 years of harvest left in this country because we've decimated our soil. I say that all the time, and then people just look at me. I say, yeah, what is the future of food? Because hydroponic farming is not the same as the soil. The soil is an ecosystem, and that 1 teaspoon of healthy soil has more microbes than there are people on Earth. How are we going to support the land and feeding of people for the future if we do not invest in our soil and our farming? So I always say to people, we have 10 years of harvest left in this country, and people's kind of just stop, you know, and ask questions at that point. That's what I say.
Thank you. I'm going to toss out another question here. for our researchers. What are the key questions on the pesticide research agenda now? And how reactive is research to the new products that companies are producing? Anybody?
Well, just from my perspective, I mean, like now we're facing the real challenge of studying glyphosate and Roundup. You know, it's a very challenging to study Roundup because, you know, all the adjuvant, it's a moving target. So it's basically like, I mean, from a toxicology point of view, I myself has a doubt how bad, you know, glyphosate itself it is. I don't have the answer for that, but if you look at the adjuvant in it, you know, it cannot be benign. But as you know, like when you apply for an NIH study, like that's where the challenging is. They want to know, like you can't really do toxicology studies without knowing what your ingredients are. So, you know, as a researcher myself, I always felt like what is the next hot chemical to study? It is a moving target. So I think there needs some change in legislative. I think one of the speakers talk about you really need to test the products, not just you know, I think the American way of thinking, they always tend to be reductionist, and they try to, even though the good things, like when you have a good diet, Mediterranean diet, they want to say, oh, it's the lycopene. So but it's everything. So it's the same thing when we expose to the environments, not just one single chemical. So I actually hate to use my slides of glyphosate-related health. It's really the products. So then we have to consider the whole pesticides as a whole, not just itself. So.
I'm sorry, Carolyn, you need to speak to the war to try and get inert ingredients disclosed, because you've done a lot in that area.
So sometime around 1980, I think, there was a Japanese physician who published some case studies of suicide attempts using Roundup, which unfortunately was a rather common suicide agent in Japan. And you know, the obvious question was, you know, this is a chemical that is being marketed as safer than table salt. How is it possible that it could be a suicide agent? And what these physicians concluded, based on their case reports, was that, you know, it was the secret ingredient in Roundup, not the glyphosate itself, that was responsible for the mortality of people who ingested the chemical for suicide reasons. And that, I think, no one had ever brought that subject up before that I know of. And it provoked an enormous amount of research, litigation, even some attempts at policy. But the fundamental issue has not changed. So it's still the case that most pesticides have unidentified secret ingredients in them that are claimed by the companies to be trade secrets. Occasionally, researchers have, you know, reverse engineered a product to find out the inert ingredients. That's actually what the Japanese researchers did, or have learned the identity through some other method, but there's no publicly available systematic information. And I think it's a huge I guess loophole is the right word. I think at this point there's probably 1,200 or so active ingredients registered for use in the US. There's probably 20,000 pesticide products, maybe more than that. So if companies actually had to test products, which is what we're all exposed to, rather than those active ingredients, we're looking at a factor of maybe 20 times greater expense. And so the companies have a real financial interest in keeping the system the way it is. And do you want to talk a little bit about the issue of, because I know you touched on it, and you're doing research.
Yeah. So I think to talk about how to catch up, it's really a question of funding, because to do a study, like how much your study with the animals would cost, it's a lot of money to do a study, and we are not working out of any budget, all our studies. Aside from this, any study requires a budget that we need to get somewhere. And in reality, on the other side, there is a lot of money available. And if you look at when I was at the EPA, the deck of studies that are registration study from Monsanto are huge, are in the thousands. And so it's an uneven competition to start because of obviously budget issues. And there are issues such as the secret, the trademark of the composition, the fact that 60%, I learned it at the meeting, the 60% of the assembling is done in China now, it's not done in the US. Right, so we don't really know who is packing what, because it's not even happening here. I guess there are rules, but I don't know. None of us is going there to check what's going on, because we would, believe it or not, that every factory that works in the US, it's checked periodically, and we could technically do a study and go in and measure things, but we're not going to measure things in China or in another country. So there are a lot of barriers to catching up with the research.
Anybody else? So here's a couple of new questions that have come in. Why do farmers use Roundup? And what are the alternatives?
They love it. They love it. Oh yeah, there were several farmers at the meeting at the EPA. They loved it because I learned a new word, tilling. You don't do the till. Yes, you don't do the thing with the soil. You don't have to turn it up. So, and usually the water takes the soil down, and then you have to bring it up. But if you treat it with the Roundup, it goes down less. I mean, there are a lot of technicalities by which the farmers love it. Yeah. And also the production is more. And, I'm just reporting because I thought that to me was one of the shocking things. I would expect the farmers to say, yeah, I know, but, it's more money. Instead, they were actively saying that their life changed. So, that's a reality.
And I need to, throw in my little soundbite here about, when we talk about alternatives, we really can't talk about alternatives to pesticide X. They don't usually work that way. So what we really want to do is talk about crop management systems that reduce the need for this kind of input. And, I think the organic farmers, have developed a lot of weed management techniques that mean that they don't need to use Roundup, and none of them are specific alternatives to Roundup, but when you take them all together, they provide a system that doesn't need that input. And the second half of the question was, will organic farming reduce crop yield and affect the worldwide war on hunger? And I'd like to hear what some of our panelists have to say about that, but there has been some really interesting work by the United Nations indicating that organic agriculture, it actually benefits the populations that are sort of most susceptible to hunger, and because you have lower inputs and creating a cropping system that's not so vulnerable to pests or drought. So does anybody want to weigh in on that question?
So I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with the Rodale Institute, but if you're not, I'd go to it. It's R-O-D-A-L-E. For years, Rodale has had an experimental farm in Pennsylvania where they've compared chemical-intensive agriculture to organic agriculture in basically adjoining fields. And the organic system is very sophisticated, using cover crops, no-till, all this stuff that works. And if you go to their website, you can see these wonderful pictures of the kind of soil. It's sort of like what we saw yesterday, this terrible, sterile soil on the chemical-intensive side, rich, deep root system and soil on the other side. And if you look at yields, what they found was that the yields in a good rain year were essentially identical between the organic and chemical intensive, but in drought years, because the soil held so much moisture, the yield was much higher in the intensive yield. So there is actually some good scientific research that suggests that organic methods are better for the soil, probably in the end cheaper, and good yield, particularly in situations of drought. So that sort of answers the question.
Yeah, if folks are not familiar with the Rodale long-term farming trials, it's well worth looking at their website. They've been doing, typical Midwest corn, soybean rotation for how long? 25 years? And using conventional, organic, and I think more recently they added conventional no-till and organic no-till. It is amazing that over the long term, the organic yields are better than the conventional ones. There's a similar study, I'm not familiar with them all, but there was a similar study in Washington State dealing with conventional versus organic apple production that had similar results. So, and I know there's more out there.
Well, I just wanted to follow up on the report that you mentioned. So it's the it's the FAO, Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations Interdepartmental Working Group on Organic Agriculture that has compiled a lot of that. And just to get to the question about why do farmers use it, I will never forget being at a Missouri farmers organization, and there was a gentleman who got up and he was saying all these negative things about Monsanto, but then that he was a conventional farmer, so he planted GMO corn seeds. So I said, well, wait a second, you know, you're saying bad things about Monsanto, but you're buying their seed. Why do you do it? And he just went, it's easy. And there were several other farmers that agreed with that, so that's why.
Let's see. So I'm actually out of my little yellow cards. So, oh, no, but no questions on it. Yeah. If you have additional questions.
Is it okay if I respond to the detox question? Is that okay? Is it all right if I respond to the detox question about detoxing pesticides? Is that okay, Carolyn, if I respond to, okay.
Yeah.
I just couldn't see you because of the light is coming in. So typically, you know, from my experience, and I go to some groups of people who've been made chemically ill, there's several physicians and naturopaths who do this kind of work. And one of the best pieces of advice I got is that you don't want to do your detox too fast, because things are like in your fat and your liver, and you don't want to, you know, just load them into your system and have them get stuck elsewhere. There's a lot of work being done, certainly with diet, you know, organic diet, good quality water, stay away from more pesticides, and that's hard to do. Infrared saunas, a lot of people do work with that. And you know, and I would certainly, there's associations of people like environmental health, functional medicine specialists, and find people who work with people who work, you know, with pesticides. And I'm just trying to think, you know, skin and liver are really important to address, you know, especially the liver. There's a lot of stuff going on, like hundreds of things. And there might be some herbalists who could help you as well. So those were just some of my thoughts, and I really like the dirt cure and the microbiome work as well that somebody else mentioned.
I did get another question here. So to any of our panelists, do alternatives to pesticides require more labor? Given labor shortages in ag, will technology offer solutions? Anybody want to take a stab at that? I mean, I will say that the Rodale study, they do factor in labor, so that goes into the economic analysis. And when they say that their organic systems are outperforming the conventional systems, that does include labor. But I think on the scale of things, corn and soybean production is relatively low labor intensive agriculture, and it's not like strawberries, for example, that are really labor intensive.
So on the non-agricultural front, certainly we watched the ban for the OP pesticide chlorpyrifos in New York City. And I will tell you that the families that we continue to recruit and work with, they tell us that the replacement insecticides in this case, like the carbamates and pyrethroids, they don't work as well. That's what the moms told us. I mean, so apparently it was a very effective chemical. That's very compelling if you're talking about small residential use.
I am an expert in non-agri, you know, even though I learn from farmers, but I don't practice, so I cannot talk with them. But I can tell you that if you're a straight shooter, you know, straight shooter means you got to be an excellent steward of the land. You know, most of the time we're confronted with that to remediate somebody else's problems. That's my job. My customers, they call me because they have problems that not even the pesticides can be able to deal with. Now, if you could be able to come up with a good ecosystem, managing the water, carbon, nitrogen, oxygen into the soil, you know, it's more expensive at first to do all that kind of stuff, a lot of work, and then eventually the system tend to do things on its own. You know, so I handle about 70 clients. I only got 2 guys working for me. This year, one person didn't come back yet. So, but we're still taking care of one person only. We just go around it, you know, very little thing. The ecosystem is working on its own. So I don't see what this big expense is. The question is, we don't set the ecosystem to be able to work on its own. That's the big mistakes we make right here.
I think there's a huge issue regarding farm workers in agriculture and working conditions and fair pay and just a whole lot of things that you know, have made farm work, well, I'm speaking from the California perspective, but have made it like not not a job that people put at the top of their list. Let's put it that way. That's something that just needs to change. Obviously, we need to eat. We all need food. The workers who grow our food, it's like the people who take care of our kids. They're utterly essential to life as we know it, and we need to treat them and pay them as if that was the case. And then I don't think there would be an issue with labor. So, let's see. Let's check and see how much time we have left.
Just 5 more minutes, really.
Yeah, so we have, I believe, 8 minutes left. This is your time to ask your last questions. Also, yeah, just express your thanks to our panelists because it's just been great to have their time today. Yeah. Does anybody have any last questions they want to?
Thanks. I forget who talked about this a little bit in the presentation, but talking about farm workers was making me think about like the effects of pesticides on being directly sprayed like aerially onto people's bodies, and like if there's been science on like not just ingesting. I think this has been addressed a little bit, but I remember, yeah, I'd just love to hear more about that.
Would any of the panelists like to address that?
So you're asking just about dermal exposures. So just, I don't really know the answer as to which studies, because a lot of times we're studying the final comment, like we're using a biomarker like a urinary metabolite or something like that. But certainly you can pick up evidence of the pesticide on people's clothing, in the dust in homes. So it is on people's bodies. There's no question about it. And I know on golf courses and things like that, you can get rashes on your legs. They use a lot of insecticides on golf courses. So it's definitely a route of exposure that people understand. Whether there are really great studies that have, maybe someone knows more than I do, separated or untangled the various routes of exposure and the relative amounts that you get from each source, I'm not sure.
The sort of California sister study to the Columbia study, the Chamaco study, they just finished a project with their teen participants wearing those silicone wristbands. And I mean, I guess that could represent a number of different routes of exposure, but definitely shows that these chemicals are getting on, you know, right there on your wrist.
Since we're getting to the end, an anecdote that I like to tell that illustrates the treachery of pesticide exposure. Many years ago, I had this, I think he was 16 or 17-year-old guy, was brought to our emergency room with severe cholinergic crisis. And he'd been working around a cotton field, but he came in coma. His lungs were full of fluid. He was having vomiting, diarrhea, and was totally paralyzed, which is a typical organophosphate poisoning event. So we put him in intensive care, put him on a ventilator, gave him lots of atropine and pralidoxime or protopam. And about 4 days later, he finally woke up from his coma, and we said, well, what in the world were you doing when this all started? Well, it turns out he was eating lunch, and he'd sat on the top of a barrel of parathion concentrate, and some of the concentrate was on the top of the barrel, and he'd absorbed it through the skin of his perineum and almost killed him. So, I mean, there are, on occasion, very bizarre exposures to pesticides, and this was a cutaneous exposure to one of the most readily absorbed organophosphates. It's an anecdote. It has nothing to do with research. But it was very interesting and instructive to me.
So I think, am I right, Sarah, that it's lunchtime? So we can continue these conversations over lunch. Thanks to everybody and especially our panelists.